You talked about popular sovereignty. I think that's a very interesting thing because it seems everything you were saying is it's hard to understand how to get people to come together when in the past few years everyone's just been sitting down and not really getting up and wanting to get things done. How do we get people to get come together so we can move past our little ideas and really make change in government and laws and stuff like that? Because in the past we've seen with how you said gay pride and women's rights as well. It always takes massive amounts of people to come together, and I'm wondering how do we come back to getting people to agree with each other to really make things happen again.
So I had a question to the panel about the sovereignty of one country layers on the sovereignty of another country. And in this sense, the instruments such as referendum is really biased. Yeah, I'm talking about the referendum like in the Crimea, like in my country. There was a referendum 30 years ago when the USSR collapsed, and I think that referendum is great. My country became independent again and stuff like that. But now there are referendums which happen in Donbass and Luhansk regions about connecting to Russia, and they seem to be directed by the government. So I mean, the whole instrument is kind of it could be used so wrongly. So I mean, is it a good instrument for the sovereignty of the country?
In 2014, there was an independence referendum on Scotland. The Scottish people voted, most of them voted no, but there is a question surrounding Scottish independence and whether we should have another one referendum.
Do you think it's right that in a referendum such as the Scottish independence referendum, it's the majority that wins each way, whether they vote yes or no or whatever the question is? Do you think that's right? Or should we raise the bar so that it's, say, 70% need to vote a certain way for it to be allowed to happen? Because you could have that with such little differences. 1 month the country wants to vote yes, 1 month the country wants to vote no, and it could all depend on what's happening at the time. So should we, in a referendum, should we raise it to a higher percentage where something should happen?
Sean, you talked about multiculturalism and shared values. Would you not argue that due to the presence of social media and the rise of globalization due to social media, that it's inevitable that there will be values that aren't shared by every group in society, especially considering that different people have are from different backgrounds, different classes, hence having shared values is an extremely rare thing for a whole nation.
We've spoken a lot about the Brexit campaign, where a big point made by Leave was that we would have more control over the laws made in this country. But looking at the lack of proportional representation in our voting system and the current Tory leadership contest, I don't think a lot of people maybe feel like those controls have been returned to us. So in a post-Brexit world, what can sovereignty look like, and what is the future of decision-making outside of the EU?
Yeah, so I wanted to start by coming back on this very difficult question of how that Sebastian asked about how we can get people to come together, because it does feel a lot of the time, particularly with this thing, the culture wars that's currently raging through all aspects of our lives, that it's inherently political who you get into bed with and how you see yourself and what you eat and how you wear your hair, and things are incredibly fractious at the moment. It does feel like it's sometimes impossible that we can come together and have some kind of shared values, but that's really a myth. It's a falsehood that we can't overcome these things. What's actually happened is that rather than treating the political square as this place where we come together and put aside our differences, whether that be our religious, views or our kind of cultural practices that we might do in our own home. I come from an Irish household, not an English household, that kind of thing. What we say is these things have to define us. And so then the bigger questions of whether you believe in free speech, whether you believe in democracy, whether you believe in tolerance, these big issues, societal issues. And what we, instead of looking at those, we're focused on the things that don't actually necessarily matter about us. And what Jon was saying was that at the moment we're being told that the differences, the things that don't necessarily matter about us, just our sort of personal preferences, should be front and center. And in actual fact, we're neglecting the bigger questions. So if you try and remember, I know lots of people characterize Brexit as this awful, terrible time, but what I remember about the referendum and the run up to it was that there were conversations happening everywhere. People were talking, and actually a similar thing happened with the invasion, unfortunately. Similar thing happened with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which is that you have this big political moment and people talk about it. People were having conversations at their dinner tables, on the bus, in pubs, and a lot of the rubbish got put aside for a bit. And then to come to the referendum question, you have to decide. I mean, if you go back to ancient Athens, where life was much smaller, societies were much smaller, and you had this great sense of people coming together in the public square to argue things out, and there was lots of rowing. We shouldn't think that arguing is a bad thing, by the way. Being nasty is a bad thing, but having a row is not. Political row. And, that sense of a direct engagement in democracy was wonderful. It produced wonderful political ideas at the time. It's very difficult to do that now because there's so many people on the planet and so many people living in nations. And so you have to decide on a format to do these things. And I think that while you can fetishize referendums, having the most direct form of asking people a question and getting them to decide on it is something that I'm very much in favour of. If I just give you one small example, in Ireland in 2018, there was a question about whether or not to change the constitution, the Irish constitution, to allow women to have access to abortion. Because previously in the constitution, there was an 8th Amendment which talked about protecting the right to the life to the unborn, and it meant that abortion in Ireland was almost impossible. And there was lots of rows in Ireland about how to do this. How can we enact this change? And first they said, we can't go straight to the people because the people are stupid. Ireland is full of thick farmers who, only know how to shovel a spade. We can't trust them with this kind of a question. And so they had a citizens' assembly where they kind of picked people at random and hothoused them and gave them all the information, and then they came to a kind of a decision. And the decision they came to was that the nation should have a referendum. So it was largely a pointless exercise in panic. Remember that thing I was talking about fear of what people can do with democracy. And when the referendum rolled around, not only was a big majority in favour of changing the constitution, but the highest proportion of yes voters to repeal the 8th Amendment were among the thick farmers in Kerry. It was in the less urban areas where proportions of voters who were wanting that kind of social change was its highest. So I think, referendums can be abused by, corrupt governments. They can be used as instruments just to have the cover of democracy and sovereignty. But actually, I think in relation to Ireland, in relation to Brexit, in relation to a possible Irish border poll coming up in the future now, that there are many examples of where it has been enacted to strengthen sovereignty and democracy. And just the final thing I'll say before passing on to another speaker is, you're very right to point out that post-Brexit, there hasn't been this wonderful shift that I was talking about. And you can let politicians get off a bit with the pandemic. You can say, okay, that was a curveball. What a weird fact of irony of history that you have a vote that completely shakes up politics in Britain and everyone's excited about it to some degree, and then life completely closes down. And nobody knew that COVID was coming, but you can't let them off really, because what you have to remember is that the decisions that have been made in politics, in Parliament in particular, over the last 3 years, whether it's to one, completely thwart Brexit. We have to remember that it didn't get enacted for years after the vote because people wanted to overturn it and pretend it didn't happen. But also in the ways in which things like freedom of speech, things like individual liberty, the right to protest have been clamped down by this Conservative government. All of that informs the power of sovereignty. But that doesn't mean I regret it, and it doesn't mean I wish it didn't happen. It means that we have to fight a bit harder to make it happen. So the latter part of your question, which is what could it look like, I think that's the thing that keeps me from digging a hole and jumping in it, because you say, well, what could it look like? How can I change things? And the exciting thing about sovereignty, to come back to that, is that if you hold the cards, then you can make the next move. And that's the thing that makes politics possible. And I think at the moment we've forgotten that actually post-Brexit there are still issues related to the House of Lords, related to the monarchy, related to a government that wouldn't know what freedom was if it got kicked in the backside, this Conservative government at the moment, and don't even get me started on Labour. But their possibility is always there. And I think that's the thing that should keep us energised for the future.
There's some very challenging questions there. Some people have asked about how you define a nation and what happens when different people in that nation want to be part of a different nation. And people have mentioned Scotland, Ireland, Cyprus, Ukraine, possibly others. And I mean, of course, the answer to all of those questions is that there's not really a simple answer, but I think there is a guiding principle, and that is that any nation should exist on the basis of consent. So if you do have a groundswell of people who wish to secede from a nation, then I think broadly speaking they should have that right. And that obviously applies both in Ireland and Scotland, so far as the United Kingdom is concerned. That doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't have a view on whether they should exercise that right. My own view is that certainly the people of Scotland should stay as part of Britain. I personally feel a bit different about Northern Ireland. It seems to me you only have to look at a map to see why there are good arguments for a united Ireland. But ultimately, that is a matter for the people of Northern Ireland to decide. Now, that principle, of course, is very difficult when you apply it to, say, Cyprus, where you have sort of 50% of the people wanting to be Greek and 50% wanting to be Turkish. And again, I think all I can say there is it has to be resolved on the basis of consent. And if there is no consent for changing the status quo, then I can't see any justification for changing the status quo at the moment. So far as Ukraine is concerned, I think the issue there is that Russia has been meddling in Ukraine ever since Ukraine has existed. And where you have a state meddling and essentially doing its best to buy the loyalty of a people in the Donbass and so on, then that is wrong. And yes, and they took Crimea by force, which was also wrong. And so I think your question about the referendum in Crimea is that I don't put much weight by that because they took Crimea by force and then asked the people whether or not they wanted to stay part of Russia. I don't think in that forceful approach that is a way of resolving these sorts of conflicts. It was once said by someone who thought about these things very deeply in the 19th century that the nation is a daily plebiscite. And I actually think that's a good way of viewing it. A plebiscite is basically a referendum, if you like. In other words, on a daily basis, the state has to justify its existence. And if it proceeds on that basis, that's one of the most powerful arguments for a nation being a democracy that you can have. Because it has to take seriously all the views of its citizens at all times. I share your concern about how we engage people in politics, because I'm struck by I'm not going to say people are apathetic, because I actually think people are very concerned about the future of their country and other issues. The problem we have, why people, for example, don't turn out in big numbers to vote in general elections and certainly don't join major political parties, is because these parties are not seen as representing them. They are not seen as being able to offer solutions. Now, just bringing that back to the issue of sovereignty, I think one of the reasons why that's happened over the last few decades is because so many issues have been shunted away from the British Parliament and outsourced to these other institutions, whether it was formerly the EU or now in particular the European Court of Human Rights, but also the World Trade Organization and other of these supranational organizations. If you take these issues away from the people and vest them in these supranational organisations, then there's no point in the people getting involved in them. Immigration is a very good example of that. A lot of people are concerned about Britain's inability to control its borders, but we don't have a debate about it because there's not much that our government can do, because it's outsourced those responsibilities through signing up to the Refugee Convention and the European Convention on Human Rights. International treaties that take power away from individual nations and vest them in these supranational organisations that mean that people do lose interest because they don't have the power that they should have.
So it's my understanding that there are two distinct types of sovereignty, which is, de facto sovereignty, a nation's ability to claim sovereignty, their factual ability to do so, and de jure sovereignty, which is their right to claim a piece of land. What I want to understand is what factors determine how strong someone's claim to a piece of land is, whether that be historical factors, social factors, or legal factors.
Don't you think that the notion sovereignty is different in different countries? And should we have a common understanding, and maybe we can have give a power, and should we give a power to this supranational organization to protect it, to give explanation and interpretation and protect? Because, for example, the notion sovereignty is understood by Ukraine in one way. Russia consider that their action are following the sovereignty principle, right?
Jon, you talked about how these international organisations like the EU are a threat to sovereignty. If that is the case, and you believe sovereignty is almost the solution to world peace, do you believe these groups have a purpose? And if so, what is that? And then in terms of diplomacy, how would that function, well, looking at sovereignty?
So, John, you mentioned about that sovereignty is often is the nation have a common set of values. So I know that I work in like early years. So in the early years education, now that in the EYFS framework, we have something called you must have the British value taught in from 0 to 5. It's so I just feel like is that something the education of young people, how do you sort of give that idea of sovereignty to the little ones? Is it right that we should compulsively ask, as a compulsory thing, must teach these young people about British value?
I've just been thinking about the two different topics that we've been talking about. So national sovereignty and then sort of individual sovereignty and autonomy. And the way I'm thinking about it is that how they interact with one another. And I think for me, national sovereignty is really almost a manifestation of individual sovereignty, in the sense that it's a reflection of the will of the people, the citizens of a country, in terms of the way that they can hold a government to account. And I think in answer then to the question that someone raised about how do people get more involved at a local level, involved in politics, it seems to me that one of the starting points for that, therefore, is actually a defence of national sovereignty in circumstances where it's become quite unpopular in recent times.
Picking up on the points about discussing in the town square from ancient Greece, is potentially a system or something that looks a bit like that, maybe a way forward to bringing or enabling more sovereignty, something that might look a bit like direct democracy, potentially even in schools encouraging discussion or debates about political topics right from the beginning, just so that people are more involved in voting. Because what it might look like is now a lot of what's happening in politics or what the politicians are doing is not necessarily reflecting the will of the people. So potentially, what do you guys think about this being a way back to getting politics, enacting the will of the people, enabling sovereignty in a bigger way?
In discussions about like global citizenship, do you think that that is like a trend specifically that young people have some kind of idea about and then they grow out of it? Or do you think that a global citizenship does actually have its perks and should be something that is confronted more?
As your point of people being afraid and people saying that they don't trust the people to make their own decisions. Some might say that it's an example of the political elite not trusting people, as some might say.
So just a quick question. Could people please put their hand up if you think you know what British values are?
I think, you raised a really important point, Helen, about how we inculcate these values in the young, which I think, talking about how we deal with children is often becomes just a specific discussion. But actually the way in which we talk about sovereignty and British values is important for how you frame, how you give form to a next generation, how you pass on the good things of a society to them. And it's fascinating that none of you put your hands up, hardly any of you, to say that you knew what British values are. And I kind of did this. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we talk about it in these really superficial terms, really superficial. So I can't remember which politician was it recently. One of the million education secretaries we've had in the last 5 years came up with this idea that in order to inculcate British values into children, we would play the national anthem, God Save the Queen, in class, and we would have a few flags. And it was incredibly superficial, because what they didn't want to talk about was what British values should be, that it should be things like an absolute belief in freedom of speech, that it should be things like a commitment to democracy, that, things like, things that are slightly more nebulous, more informal. Like if you're trying to talk to a class full of 4-year-olds about something like sovereignty, without baffling them, you could talk to them about things like loyalty, a sense of loyalty to your class and to your sports team in your school, that then, as they get older, reflects out to a loyalty to your neighbourhood and a loyalty to your fellow citizens. It doesn't really, that's why it's so important to say it doesn't really matter where you culturally are from. Whether you go home and eat with your hands or eat with a knife and fork, whether you go to mosque or church, or whether you do these kind of cultural things, that actually if you come together and say, I'm loyal to my fellow citizen, and in the case of Ukraine, that becomes absolutely visceral in terms of you have ordinary people like those of us sat around here, maybe a bit older, picking up weapons to defend the loyalty of their fellow citizens and defend the sense that they are all one nation, then that's how you inculcate the idea of how important sovereignty is. It's not, you can't force it, because it's not a superficial thing. It has to be this thing that embeds all part of your political sensibility. So it's actually quite easy to talk to young people about it. You're not going to sit there and say, the thing about the European Court of Human Rights to 5-year-olds, are you? But in imbuing a society with that sense of even just the simple idea that it is a good thing to have British values, that is a good thing to have a set of ideas that you all coalesce around, that you're loyal to. I think that is at least the starting point for any kind of movement onwards. And on the point of global citizenship, the problem with this is I think that so many, particularly young people, who are sort of like just coming out of school age and maybe they're going to university or maybe they're doing other things, is that the constant refrain I get is, oh, well, national sovereignty. I want to go on the Erasmus scheme, or I want to travel the world. As if no one ever did that before the European Union, and, our parents and grandparents never left the country ever, and no one ever saw another nation. But also this sense, coming back into the superficial idea, this sense that you couldn't be two things at once. You can't be a loyal citizen of the UK or of Cyprus or Ireland or wherever, that you couldn't be that and also an open international person who respects and enjoys the global life of going to a different nation and interacting with those people. We've got to really get past this idea that anything related to national or popular sovereignty is like being a little Englander, because it's such a stupid way of understanding the significance of sovereignty. Having the sense of a national identity and a set of British values doesn't mean that you force people fish and chips every day, which is what it's become. It's what it's become, and that is such an insult to the political ideal of what sovereignty is and what it could be.
So when we had that referendum a few moments ago on did we know what British values were, very few of us said that they did. And only a few miles from where we are at the moment in Bethnal Green, there is a school where a few years ago the head teacher went round to all of her school children, this was an infant and junior school, and she asked them if they felt British. And very few of them said that they did. Then she asked them if they felt Bangladeshi, and a large number of them said they did. She thought that was highly problematic, and she wanted to do something about it. So she noticed that a number of these young children, this was infant and junior, as I say, were wearing a veil and were covering up their heads. And she discussed with her governors, and they decided that this was not the right thing to do. This was not the British way, particularly not for children as young as those up to the age of 11. So they introduced a policy that these headscarves would not be allowed. And there was an outcry. And she was accused of being Islamophobic and racist and all the rest of it. And she received death threats and so on and so forth. And the policy was overturned. Now, my point about that is that shows that in Britain we have a problem. Because even when you have, and this was a very good, well-performing school, exceedingly diligent headmistress. She just wanted the best for her local community. When you have situations like that and people are not even allowed to encourage a sense of Britishness, it is not surprising that when we're asked, do we feel British, even more so, do we know what British values are, we tend to say no. And that is highly problematic. You only have to say to yourselves, what would have happened in 1939 when we faced a serious threat from Nazi Germany? How could we have got people to fight for the defence of freedom and democracy? How could we have got people to pay for and to put their lives on the line if people don't even feel that sense of loyalty sufficient to call themselves British? And of course we know exactly how important this is in Ukraine at the moment. The Ukrainian people are a credit to all of us in demonstrating that they know what it is to be Ukrainian and they know how important it is to defend their nation. Just on some of the questions that have been asked related to this about how you foster this sense of Britishness and to what extent you should be coercive, particularly with younger age kids. I'm very much in favour of the voluntary approach. I think if you have a culture which encourages a sense of Britishness, then it will happen. And the obvious example was with that school teacher who should have been allowed, she was the headmistress, her governors supported her. She should have been allowed to do what she wanted to do. But because we celebrate multiculturalism and we put it on a legal footing, that is, for example, when you get official communications from your local authority, they are quite often written in a dozen different languages. So there are many people in this country who have been here for many years, decades even, who do not learn English. They cannot speak English well. They don't feel the need to. And that is because the Equality Act, for example, requires public bodies to be able to have dispensations towards people who come from overseas. And so you lose immediately that very essential need to even speak and understand the language with which we all communicate to one another. So if you change the legal framework and had a policy of encouraging a sense of Britishness, then I believe that the values which I think we all subscribe to, they would come to the fore. And that is the only essential basis on which you can have a nation which is at ease with itself. And I think that's what we all need. It requires effort, but it can be done. But we need to have a sense of the importance of our nation and of its history and culture.
This is certainly a topic which we could talk about for much longer, but I'm afraid that's all we're going to have time for now. Thank you very much to Jon, Ella and Lada for their contributions and everybody else who's contributed to the discussion. So thank you.